Harvard University, widely traveled in the third world as part of that work you did before you retired full-time up here to the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont in 2002. Welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dave. Great pleasure.
Yeah, and Clive, tell me a little bit about, this is really interesting to me. You have this perspective as a development economist, and you were mentioning on the break that you had done a lot of your work in the third world, but one of the themes of really the biggest theme of this series we're doing this summer is how are small towns in Vermont coping with economic changes and keeping the communities vibrant and that sort of thing. I'm sure it's quite a bit different than you might have run into in Latin America or Africa or any other places you were traveling during your working career. But tell me a little bit about what you see here in terms of the vibrancy, the hopes for the future, and that sort of thing here in Greensboro.
Well, of course, Greensboro is considered a resort community, among other hats that it wears. We have Caspian Lake, which has been the major attraction of the summer community since the 19th century.
Yep.
And so the Greensboro Land Trust has now conserved over 1,100 acres. The Vermont Land Trust has conserved probably about 3,000 acres in town. The Nature Conservancy has conserved about 1,000 acres. And so we are trying to keep the rural character of the community. On the other hand, we also recognize that there is a need for commercial activity. There's a need for residences. One of the big problems which came out, in fact, at our annual meeting Monday of this week, we had a panel of people, and one of entrepreneurs who are working on conserved land in Greensboro. And one of the big issues is that taking land out of commercial or residential use means that the value of land for residences is increasing, and it's making it hard for employees of the various enterprises in town to buy land in Greensboro and to live in Greensboro. So in fact, one of the figures that has been calculated is that about 90% of the people who earn their living in Greensboro,
a larger source for,
don't live in the town. They live in neighboring towns, and so obviously have to commute to work. So that's one of the issues we're worried about.
And that, of course, increases traffic, and obviously commuting is I don't know that people think about this much, but it's a huge time sink. You know, if you spend a half an hour in the morning and a half an hour in the evening in your car, that's an hour out of your day that you could have been, reading a book or just relaxing, or maybe learning how to play a musical instrument. Who knows? But
or visiting with your children,
visiting with your family,
spouse.
Absolutely, yeah. And any number of other activities in life that are probably more rewarding than sitting behind the wheel of a car. So, not to mention
suggestions that has been made is that we should try to develop some of what's called cluster housing, where people would have their residences fairly close to one another. Each residence could have a total of 10 acres, let's say, so the rural character of the town would not be infringed, be fairly close to one another, and then the 10 acres of rural land would sort of radiate out from the cluster of houses. So it would require an entrepreneur to make an investment in that kind of a project, but it's something that is being looked at, particularly by the Planning Commission.
So if you wanted to put 5 housing units on one parcel, let's say, is what is envisioned a 50-acre parcel because you need 10 acres per, or could you put five housing units at the center of, or somewhere on 10 acres and then preserve the other 9 acres, let's say?
Yeah, I think as of now that would be the mode that would be required by the zoning ordinance.
So you'd need a 50-acre parcel to put 5 housing units.
Yeah.
Even that, it sounds to me like you'd be running into the similar problems of just a shortage of possible building sites and and then driving up the cost, obviously. And I don't know. It sounds like people are thinking about this stuff, though. So that's
Exactly.
first
Yeah.
step in making progress, right?
Exactly.
And any other challenges that you see as a person with a planning background here in Greensboro? You know, housing obviously sounds like maybe the biggest one, but what about transportation or access to services? Obviously, it's a very rural area up here. Access to the internet, cellular phones, etc. What are people talking about here in terms of what we'd like to see added to our community in the coming years?
Well, we're very happy with the access that we have to the internet and to cell phone service. It's not at a high level of professional activity, of course, and I have a nephew who is actually working to computerize a lot of the data in the Historical Society, of which I am the treasurer, and he has to go to the Hardwick Library to have the kind of internet access that is needed to get some of this data stored. So we would love to see a somewhat higher grade internet access here.
Higher speed internet, yeah.
Higher speed, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Although let me give you a little bit of devil's advocate pushback on that one, because I remember several years ago I was in a very rural part of Massachusetts visiting a friend, and a bunch of old friends were gathered there, and one of them, it was about midnight. I think he was getting a little hungry, and he said, "Why isn't there an all-night Chinese restaurant?" He was from Cambridge, actually, your old stomping grounds. He said, "Why isn't there an all-night Chinese restaurant across the road here? What's the matter with this place?" and I just said, "Man, you are crazy. You're out here in a beautiful rural area, and you want an all-night Chinese restaurant across the road? Come on, snap out of it." And so, I mean, should you expect to make a trade-off when you come to a beautiful rural place like Greensboro, Vermont? You say, "Listen, we're not going to have the highest speed internet. We're not going to have 5 bars on our cell phone every time we glance at it, etc."
That's a very fair observation. I must say that with the establishment of the Highland Center for the Arts, which you may be covering in your program today, this was opened over a year ago now.
Yep.
They have a lovely cafe, so for the first time in several years, one can go for a breakfast, lunch, or dinner right in town without having to go all the 6 miles to Hardwick.
Oh my word! A journey like that for a meal out. I hear the Hardwick Street Cafe. I hear it's quite good.
That's right. That's the one at the
Highland Center for the Arts.
Yeah.
That Highland Center for the Performing Arts, I think, is the formal name. Is that right?
Well, HCA, Highland Center for the Arts, but it is performing arts, of course. That's
Yeah, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And I hear I haven't actually had a chance to make it to one of the programs there yet. It's on my to-do list sometime in the next couple of months. But I hear on WDEV, for instance, announcements about upcoming performances there, and it sounds like they're getting in some great people and great programs.
They are indeed.
Yeah.
Musicians, dramas, films. It's really greatly increased the cultural offerings here in Greensboro.
In fact, I had some guests on just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. On just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. On just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. On just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. On just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. On just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. On just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. On just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. On just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. On just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. On just a couple of weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare Festival, and I think they have a show that's going on perhaps this week. It's on just a couple weeks ago from the Vermont Shakespeare. I would do such a thing. I'm just saying, reminding folks of that admonition. I need to remind myself sometimes. But this is tough. I'm sitting here. Actually, I will say, I've tried now all three types of the cheese that are sitting in front of me. I think we have a really nice cheddar here. We have their Alpha Tolman and the Harbison, which is a creamier. It's in a bowl. It's a creamy cheese, and all of them are just spectacular. And as I was sampling them, I was saying, yep, not surprised these guys have won some international awards for their cheeses, because they are delicious. So anyway, and in fact, I think we may get a visit. I'm not sure 100%, but are we going to get a visit, Dave? Do you know?
I think Mateo Keeler's coming down. That was the word I got.
From the Jasper Hill Farm, the makers of these delicious cheeses here. And so we're going to blame him on the air when he gets here, if any of our listeners have to put up with me chewing or something. So, but Dave Kelly, you're a relative newcomer to Greensboro, and I wanted to get a perspective of somebody who is in that place in life. Tell us, why'd you move here?
Well, to some extent, it was just an accident. My wife and I have always loved the Northeast Kingdom. I have some businesses in Montpelier. Then we do need better cell service, and we do need faster internet service. But going forward, we need to be careful that we don't Disneyland ourselves, that we don't hit a tipping point where the beauty of this place becomes the attraction that kills it. So we've got to walk forward with a balanced look, but plainly, we need to make some changes. We need to change our zoning laws. I think here in the center of town, we need to create a septic system that works for everybody. Mm-hmm. And we need to be well aware of the pitfalls of Act 46 and the dangers it presents for keeping our school here in town.
Well, tell me a little more about that. I mean, you were on was it the regional school or the?
I was on the Hazen School Board, and I was on the Act 46 study committee that we put together for our community. And it's interesting. Act 46 is kind of an Orwellian statute. They open up the statute with an introduction that says it isn't the intent of this statute to close small schools. But if you begin to understand the statute and how it works, that's very much the intent. For one thing, the small schools grants that were put in place in 1997, recognizing the importance of small schools here in Vermont, those are at risk of being lost, and those are important to communities like Greensboro. More importantly, with these mergers, especially the forced mergers where small schools are forced to merge with a larger community, when those larger communities control the school board and they need to boost their equalized pupil numbers and their revenues, the most tempting thing is to close a small school and use those students to juice up the larger community's revenues and pupils. So going forward, there's going to be a lot of conflict. I feel like we here in Greensboro are really very much devoted to our school, and I think we're going to be able to preserve our small elementary school.
And it seems to me that if there's a little bit of chicken and egg thing going on here, because you want to keep the school population up, you want to attract more young families to move to Greensboro, and if either of those things don't work, then the likelihood grows that you lose your school. And if there's any signal to young families with kids to not move to a community, that would be one, right?
That would be it. That would be, I think, to a very large extent, the death knell to some of the small rural communities in the Northeast Kingdom.
Yeah, and I sort of wonder. I mean, I was asking this question a little bit earlier in the program, one of our other guests, and I just wonder, when I go down the list of businesses that have come here since, they say, the turn of the century, 18 years ago. I think Circus Smirkus may have been around a little longer than that, but I think Pete's Greens is probably in that category. Jasper Hill Cheese, I don't know, have they been around for a long time? Jasper Hill, I'm not sure. Certainly Hill Farmstead is one of the newer entrants in the local commerce here.
Right.
And with all of these things going on, is it? I mean, it seems like also that Greensboro might survive in a reasonably good shape if it had to, without a school. I'm not. I mean, what do you think about that?
Greensboro's going to survive no matter what, because we have the lake.
Yeah.
We have one of the 3 most beautiful lakes in the state of Vermont, and that will be here. And we have people who are committed to preserving the beauty of the lake. We have. Not everybody in the state capital is committed to conserving the beauty of our lake as we are locally, but that attraction alone gives us some certainty. Going forward, though, if we want to be the kind of community that I think most people envision, we plainly are going to have to attract more younger families. This is getting to be an older community. Act 60 had a big impact. A lot of families.